Welcome to The Art of Catholic. I'm Matthew Leonard. Our topic of discussion today is one I think is perhaps the most underrated yet ridiculously powerful in the world, particularly in discussions related to the faith. That topic is beauty. Now, beauty was not something that was at the forefront of my conversion into the faith many years ago, but it's something for which I have grown in appreciation, to put it mildly. There's just no way around it. As Catholics, we have to emphasize beauty. In fact, one of the things we're going to talk about in this show is that we have a duty with regard to beauty. And yes, apologetics, scripture study, things like that are certainly important, obviously, right? But beauty is a different animal. It's got a mysterious power that not even the most powerful or well thought out argument can withstand. And while a lot of people and culture in general have done their best to mangle it over the past few decades, beauty is thankfully making a comeback. Now, as I said, it has this unmistakable attraction and irresistible power to penetrate even the most hardened of souls and turn their eyes toward God. Why? Well, that's what we're going to get into, part of what we're going to get into today on the Art of Catholic podcast. And I really enjoyed this conversation. But speaking of beauty, before I introduce my extremely engaging guest, you're going to love him, I want to tell you that in March 2026, I'm leading a pilgrimage into the heart of the most beautiful woman ever fashioned, with all due respect to my wife. And I'm talking about Our Lady. The anchor points of this pilgrimage are Fatima and Lourdes, sites of two of the most celebrated apparitions of Mary. So what could be better, right? We're going to explore the homes of the three saint children, so Lucia, Jacinta, Francisco, participate in rosary processions and more in Fatima. You can even see the assassin's bullet that was meant to kill St. John Paul II, which fits perfectly inside the crown of Fatima. It's pretty amazing. At the other end of the trip, we're going to head to the famous grotto in Lourdes, France, and celebrate Mass where Mary appeared to St. Bernadette and declared, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Of course, there are beautiful churches, the healing baths, incredible processions there as well. I mean, both of these are just ridiculously incredible places. But that's just the front and the back end of the trip. We're going to the Church of St. Anthony of Padua in Lisbon, among other places. We're going to venerate the Eucharistic miracle at Santarém, as well as Avila, Spain, the monastery where Saints Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross resided. Salamanca, which is just, it's one of the most beautiful places you'll ever see. Burgos, Loyola, Spain, where we're going to celebrate Mass in the room where St. Ignatius had his big conversion. It's all incredible stuff. If you didn't see it already, I created a short video showing where we're going. You can check it out by clicking the link below in the show notes. But if you don't see a link in your podcast player, you're on audio podcast or whatever, just go to scienceofsainthood.com. There's a link at the top of the page that will take you to the pilgrimage. If you want to just call someone and talk to them about it, you can do that at 800-206-TOUR, 800-206-8687. That's the phone number for my buddies at 206 Tours. They're simply the best. Just tell them you want info on my Fatima, Spain, and Lourdes tour, and I'd love it if you'd come. It's going to be an amazing, amazing pilgrimage. But speaking of amazing, let's get to our podcast on beauty. John Mark Miravalle teaches philosophy and theology at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. He's the author of 5 books, including How to Feel Good and How Not to, Thinking Clearly, Catholic Philosophy for a Culture in Chaos, and Beauty, What It Is and Why It Matters, published by Sophia Institute Press, which is the one we're going to be talking about today. You can find his debates on God's existence, same-sex marriage, and theistic morality over on YouTube. He and his wife, Jessica, have 7 children. Welcome to the Art of Catholic, John Mark.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, you and I have been acquaintances for years, and I see you every now and then outside of Mass when you come back to town because you grew up in Steubenville, where I live. And your father and my father-in-law have been longtime professors at Franciscan University. So we have a bit of a connection, and I'm really glad to have you on.
Yeah.
Particularly because Prophet has no respect in his hometown. You know, I went down and showed my wife your book here, Beauty. And I said, John Mark, and she knows exactly what I'm talking about. He wrote this great book, and she knows you as a kid. I think there's like videotape of you playing football, like in her backyard, I think, growing up.
Probably not very well. Yeah.
But you have a long history with the family. This book is really good. In fact, as I was telling you before we started recording, a friend of mine who teaches theology at Franciscan University brought it up. And he said, I'm going to start using this book for my class. And so I moved you to the top of my podcast pile. And this is such an important topic of beauty. So maybe to kick this off, you could just kind of do us a favor and define beauty so we're all starting from the same spot. What is it exactly?
Good. So there's no sort of canonically agreed on definition, and you're going to get different definitions and certainly descriptions from different philosophers and theologians through the tradition. So my proposed definition that I like to work with is beauty is a combination of order and surprise. So beauty is order, which basically means things working the way they're supposed to work and being the way they're supposed to be, combined with surprise, which is when we recognize that this state of affairs is not obvious. We're not too familiar. We're not used to it. You put those two together, and I think you get beauty.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get into some of this because the interplay of surprise with beauty I found really fascinating. So I want to talk about that in a little bit. But sometimes we hear beauty mentioned along with a couple of other things, truth and goodness. What are these three things together? What are they called? And what's the relationship between them?
Yeah, so there's, particularly in the Thomist tradition, there's this concept of the transcendentals. And the transcendentals are ways of receiving and engaging with all reality. So just as we say that God is the ultimate reality, we say he's the ultimate truth, he's the ultimate goodness, and he's the ultimate beauty. So the example I give in the book is when I clap my hands, I see it, hear it, and feel it. Because even though it's one event, I have multiple receptors for reality. So I think an easy way to understand it is truth, goodness, and beauty describe the same reality, but received through different human receptors. If we receive it through the intellect, we call it truth. If we receive it through the will's recognition of its fullness, we call it goodness. And I would say if we receive it through the intellect and will, and also our passions respond, then we call it beauty. Our feelings, our emotions, then we call it beauty.
When just for people who aren't familiar with this, when we're talking about the Thomist tradition, it's talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and his approach to philosophy and theology. One of the really eye-opening things for me, I mean, we hear a lot about truth. We hear a lot about goodness, right? We don't hear as much about beauty typically, particularly in our very utilitarian culture. We were talking about going to Europe and, the problems of travel and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But, when you go to Europe, it's a completely different experience than traveling around the United States. It's getting more homogenous, but you can, and I do this all the time. I'll wake up in a particular town where I'm speaking or whatever, and it looks very much like the last city that I was in. And there's not a whole lot of distinction other than geography. And part of it is because we just homogenize beauty. We become very utilitarian, box stores, strip malls and all the rest of that kind of stuff. But there's a real power to beauty, even when it comes to, maybe especially when it comes to conversion. I met a guy who had no formation at all, and it was beauty that led him to the faith because he bought this picture of Madonna and Child, and he didn't even know who it was. And he said it was just so beautiful. He arranged his entire art collection around it. And eventually he's like, I got to find out about this picture. And it was the beauty of it that drew him in. And of course it was Our Lady and Christ. And it led to his conversion. This guy's now, a very influential Catholic. It's really incredible what beauty can actually do for us.
No, it's an incredible insight when you realize that truth and beauty are coextensive, because that has so many ramifications practically. On the one hand, it helps you remember that what seems beautiful but has no regard for truth is actually just manipulation. So the only difference between beauty and manipulation is whether there is a concern for truth. That's point one. Another point is, if truth and beauty are coextensive, then until you have shown that something is beautiful, you have not finished showing that it is true. Your work is not done. Your convincing transmission is not done. And, I teach at a seminary, and I say to the guys, look, if beauty is order and surprise, and if beauty is essential to showing the truth of the truth, then if you give homilies that are neither orderly nor surprising, that are just a jumble of cliches, then you're sinning against the truth, and you're going to be answerable to God for that one day.
Whew. Man, think about that just with regard to parents. If we don't make life beautiful for our children, then we're responsible for that as well, which puts a lot of pressure on us because I live in Steubenville, man. So it's hard to find the beauty sometimes.
That's right.
The university is gorgeous.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
The rest of the town, we're getting there though. There's been some change around here.
That's right.
And some people would say, but Steubenville is beautiful. And let's just use Steubenville as an example. Is it legitimate to say that beauty is just in the eye of the beholder?
No, it's not legitimate to say that. There's a couple of distinctions that need to be made. So first of all, when we talk about, let's say, a place like Steubenville, or we'll talk about a person's home or something like that, obviously we want to distinguish between more superficial and less superficial forms of beauty. So for instance, I have a very beautiful family. Because I have a beautiful family, I have a beautiful house, but my house is often a mess. So if someone would go in and say, wow, the Miravalle's house is such a mess, we would say, you know what, actually, you might not be noticing the deeper levels of beauty that's actually in that house. Granted, it would be nice if it wasn't a mess. But let's keep primary things primary. So that's point one in a place like Steubenville is you have to distinguish layers of beauty. And it's good to have beauty everywhere, but you don't want to let the superficial ugliness distract from the deeper beauty. That's point one. Point two is beauty, because remember, it's coextensive with truth and goodness, is every bit as objective as truth and goodness. But like with truth, like with goodness, so with beauty, different people have different degrees of sensitivity and awareness. And that's largely based on training and based on practice, based on the effort you've invested. So it's perfectly fair to say that, for instance, I'm not as sensitive to architecture as someone else is. But it's dumb to say that the beauty of architecture depends on how sensitive or how well trained I am relevant to my architectural knowledge.
I could use scripture as an example of that as well. If you can draw some beauty out of a passage of scripture to someone who has no idea what the Bible is talking about, they're not going to see the same level of beauty in that passage that you might if you have a deep relationship with God.
Yeah. I mean, take a more humdrum example, but seasonal. You know, a lot of secular people watch The Passion and just find it repulsive because they really lack the wherewithal to see. One example I use a lot in classes is different people will often get different answers to the eye exam when you get down to those lower levels. That doesn't prove that the eye exam is subjective. It just proves that different people have different degrees of vision.
This is super important for people to understand because a lot of people go awry if they don't get what it is you were just talking about. And let's go back to something you kind of touched on already, because one of the things you bring out in your book is that beauty is everyone's moral responsibility. I mean, you use the example of priests and we talked about parents. Can you unpack that a little bit more? Why is it a moral responsibility for us to do this?
Yeah, so there's a way in which it's true to say that all morality, every moral teaching, every moral principle is geared towards the fulfillment of the human person. Aquinas has this wonderful line in the Summa Contra Gentiles where he says, God is not offended by us except insofar as we act against our own good. So all morality is based on the human person as designed by God. Now, beauty corresponds to our design because beauty is where you get the intellect and the will and the passions, like I said, our feelings, all working together in pursuit of the ultimate realities which ultimately terminate in God. So there's no way to fulfill the human person except by beauty. We were literally made for beauty, and morality is based on what we were made for. So you have to cultivate your intellect and your will and your passions so that we can respond to the beautiful, because that's ultimately what heaven is responding to the supreme beauty forever.
How does beauty actually affect us? Like, what's the mechanism that moves us when we encounter something beautiful?
That's a great question. Okay, so a couple pieces. One is, if beauty is order and surprise, right, then the order corresponds to the intellect, because our intellect is made to recognize the way things are supposed to fit together. The surprise corresponds to our freedom, because we are made in the image of God, and so we do not have to be the way we are. And because this world was made by intelligent freedom, who is God, this world and its basic structure corresponds to our basic structure. And so beauty is the match between the world and the configuration of our rational soul, which is made in the image of God. So, for instance, one example I give is, that's why it's so awful to teach in a hideous classroom, like a classroom that looks like you caught a frog in it and poked some holes in the top so it could breathe. Like, how do I teach about what is higher than human in a space that is lower than human? You're literally working against the ugliness of the room as you try to present beauty. So the mechanism is just the human design. And when we get surprised by the order and the unnecessary goodness that we behold, we respond with pleasure. The order produces a peaceful pleasure, and the surprise produces an excited pleasure. And that is the height of human existence. To be both peaceful and excited at the good is happiness.
So recognizing the good, conforming ourselves. It's actually, the beauty is present. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's kind of what you're saying. The beauty is present, and us conforming ourselves to this beauty is our recognition of that beauty and moving toward it. So it's kind of like truth is conforming one's mind to reality, to kind of put the Thomistic phrase out there. So it's present. We're just moving towards it the more we recognize it.
Yeah. We recognize the truth, we will the good, and we allow the pleasure of the surprise and the order to sort of, and right, literally what actually happens when you hit beauty, when the surprise of the goodness and truth hits you, you get goosebumps, right? I mean, you get some physical thrill that runs through your system, and you also feel at peace. That's how you know you found what you were made for.
Well, let's talk about something that kind of tees you up to receive beauty in this way, and that would be, asceticism. We're recording this during Lent, and so we're in the period of ascetical activity. And basically, asceticism is training ourselves through self-denial. We're exercising virtue and gaining control over ourselves. Why is it that asceticism is a prerequisite for aestheticism?
Wonderful.
Like preparing us for beauty.
Wonderful. So one of the great threats to beauty is what I call overindulgence in surprise, which means a taste for disorder. So if you get too attached to the surprise element of beauty and you just want too much of it and you want it too easily, you will become subject to the law of diminishing returns, and the same stimulus will no longer give you surprise. So the easiest example in our age is pornography, right? If you start looking at pornography produces impotence in men, because for men, the sexual experience is part of beauty, and beauty is part of the sexual experience, and you have to be surprised. There has to be a thrill. But when you get used to something, you can't respond with a thrill anymore, so you have to go down that rabbit hole of weirder, freakier stuff. On the other hand, if you exercise self-restraint, you never get used to the beautiful thing, which means you're always able to see it as beautiful. And it's true of food, it's true of colors, it's true of video, it's true of all kinds of things. If we are intemperate, we will get used to something, and when we get used to it, we can no longer be surprised and therefore see it as beautiful. So we have to restrain ourselves to preserve the surprise. In other words, so that we don't take it for granted. And ultimately, right, on the spiritual level, we have to be temperate on material elements of beauty so that we can begin to see supernatural, spiritual elements of beauty.
Yeah. So to your point, when you get through Lent and Easter comes and you can drink a cup of coffee again, it tastes a whole lot better, now than it did when you were drinking 8 cups a day, during the rest of the year. I remember a very poignant experience I had of this when my wife and I were still dating. We had tickets to go to the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. And so we show up and we were late, and I was annoyed because I hate being late. And we're standing out in the like under the stairs there. The first piece had already begun. And I've told this story before, but I mean, I just was not into classical music at the time. I didn't appreciate its beauty. I wasn't formed well enough to recognize it. But as soon as the orchestra kicked into Ralph Vaughan Williams' Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis, when it started, I was absolutely mesmerized. I mean, I was like raptured out of myself in the moment. It was such a beautiful, surprising experience. And when the piece was over and we took our seats, all I could think about was that music. And when the concert was over a few days later, I went and I bought the disc of it. It was still beautiful, but it didn't contain the same element of surprise. It didn't move me quite as much as it did that first time around. And I still love the piece. I still listen to it, fairly regularly, but it's never going to be the same as that first encounter with it. So, I mean, talk about the surprise element. Like when we're talking about surprise, what does that really mean in the context of beauty?
Yeah, in this case, it means, again, unfamiliarity, not taking it for granted. It means awareness of its non-obvious, like being able to feel. So let me give some examples because I think it's helpful. I remember when I was first working on this class and working on the book, Jess said, I said, it's order and surprise. She said, well, what do you mean about order? By order? I said, well, order is what makes certain things predictable. And Jess, my totally non-supportive wife, said, well, that doesn't work because if something's predictable, it can't be surprising. So I don't think your definition works. So I went into a minor depression. But then I thought about it, and it's really, really interesting. The people who know the most about something are the ones most likely to be surprised at it because they are willing to continually delve deeper and find deeper and deeper levels of order. So, for instance, I like chess. I'm constantly saying, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful mating pattern. I don't like baseball. So I'm never surprised by baseball because I know the basic rules, but that's about it. But people who really love baseball and watch a ton, they're always saying, oh my gosh, I've been watching this game 30 years. I never saw that. Right? So they know enough to be surprised. And Sheen has this great line where he says, a husband's wife stops being beautiful to him when he stops learning more about her so he can be continually surprised by her. So this idea of, and if I could like make a shirt or something, a bumper sticker for the message that I would love to give the world, it's the discipline of delight. This is an age that has lost the discipline of delight. We have no discipline, and so we have no delight, and it's killing us. It's killing us. But to know what beauty is and that there's always more order, more rightness that can surprise you, that's hope for a happy rest of your life and then an eternity of it.
A personal example of what you're talking about, I think, like I study the spiritual life. That's what I focus on. That's what I teach. The more I learn about it, the more beautiful it becomes. The more I'm surprised when I find something that relates to, in somebody else's book, a Gregory of Nyssa or whatever. I pull something out, I'm like, whoa. It would have had no impact on me had I not done all the study, leading up to that and preparing myself to receive what it is that he had to say. And I love this idea about discipline as a prerequisite for beauty. What happens when we don't have the discipline? Like if we're going to reject this, what does culture actually do at that point? If they don't have the discipline to prepare themselves, where do they go?
So I have a chapter in there, and this was for me like the biggest epiphany of my research into beauty was to see when you get lazy about beauty and you stop pursuing the discipline of delight, you're gonna split the two halves of beauty apart. You're either going to do what we talked about before. You're going to just go for surprise, not order. And that's easy. That just means you look for perversion. And that's, been going on since the Colosseum and before. People getting entertainment by what is surprising and disordered. Quentin Tarantino or whoever's making the freaky movies now.
Exactly.
On the other hand, and by the way, that's where like progressives lean. Where conservatives lean is actually on the other side. They get lazy about beauty and they go for order without surprise. And they just get comfortable in the same cliches. They repeat the same formulas. They, let's say the rosary and never meditate on what it means. They have their same meals. They say the same things. They watch the same news or the same talk shows, which just repeat the same tired partisan points. And they just live in a rut. And here's what I think is really interesting. It seems to me that basically many people have split life into these two fragmented halves of beauty. They go to work, which they see as banal, order without surprise, same thing over and over. And then they come home and they go into disorder, either by looking at porn or some freaky Netflix nonsense or some news that convinces them that everything is disordered and messed up. And then they go back and they do it over again. It's just a cycle of ugliness. That's what happens. The ugliness of banality and the ugliness of disorder. That's what happens if you abandon the discipline of beauty.
Let me read a line out of your book. I just found this really so poignant. You said, an easy escape from boredom into surprise, easier than working to perceive even deeper levels of order, is just to go against the nature of things. Can you draw that out? I mean, and I was watching a movie. Let me just say this first before you do. I was watching a cartoon movie with my kids not long ago. I think it was Penguins of Madagascar or something like this. And literally one of the characters said, well, I reject nature, and then they just moved on. I'm like, wow. I mean, talk about like a bomb. Like this is a kid's movie. Yeah, I reject nature.
Very explicit. Yeah. So the idea of order is things being the way they're supposed to be and doing what they're supposed to do. Disorder, then, by definition, means going against the nature of things. And obviously, I mean, it's sort of a cliche to bring up things like transgenderism or things like, I don't know. I mean, I bring up in the book snuff films. I mean, things where you break what is good. Things where you take delight in seeing. I've heard this phrase a couple times. Oh, I love it. It's so messed up. That's perfect, right? If you're ever tempted to say, ooh, I love it. That's really messed up. Again, I tell my kids, and this was really helpful. When I was in college, a priest once said, horror movies are just a different form of pornography because both are taking pleasure in seeing the nature of the human person violated. So all that stuff is just bad, bad, bad. And certainly, look, if you watch the news because you just want to delight in things going wrong, same thing. Are you getting your pleasure from stuff being messed up? That's not preparation for hell. That's for heaven. That's preparation for choosing hell.
I'm glad I don't like horror movies. You kind of riffing on this whole idea of order and beauty. I mean, you have a interesting section where you talk about beauty and symmetry, right? And dimensions and number. What's the relationship between beauty and symmetry? Yeah,
so there are lots of different ways where you can tell that something has been ordered by intelligence. Symmetry is one way. It's not the only way. Proportion, number, right? The stuff from the Book of Wisdom. There's lots of signs that you say, oh, intelligence has been at work here. And I really try to be careful when it comes to art, not to dismiss an art unless I'm sure that the person did not infuse some order into it, which I'm just unaware of so far. Because there are different types of order. And look, one of the books I use from Father Basil Cole, when he was in seminary, people said, oh, jazz is of the devil because there's no order there. But of course, there is an order to jazz. It's actually a very deep, subtle order, and it's totally legitimate. So symmetry, parallelism, this is one kind of sign that intelligence has been at work, and therefore that there's order. But there are different indicators, and you don't want to condemn any work of art just because it doesn't have your favorite indicator. You might be surprised if you open yourself to it that there's a new kind of order that's worth appreciating.
Hey guys, we'll be back to the interview in just a moment. Are you or a group you're part of seeking authentic Catholic spiritual teaching that will finally provide understandable, serious formation and direction? Do you want to learn to pray more deeply and make actual spiritual progress? If so, I'd like to introduce you to the Science of Sainthood. It's an online teaching program that offers step-by-step Catholic spiritual formation for people who are ready to move into a real relationship with God. Featuring a series of beautiful bite-sized video courses, meditations, and scripture laid out in a particular order, you'll finally discover a clear path to holiness. We also offer video studies for parish groups with workbooks and leader guides, as well as individual courses for personal study. Based on spiritual giants like Saints John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and many others, the Science of Sainthood is dynamic, practical spiritual guidance specifically designed to draw you into a closer communion with God. You've never seen anything like this until now. Go to scienceofsainthood.com and experience what tens of thousands of Catholics the world over have already discovered. Scienceofsainthood.com. More than education, this is transformation. What do you do with when you say you're sure of a piece of art that it didn't try to infuse order? Are you referencing things like, the Met, having a toilet bowl on display, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, things that are really trying to attack order. The piano piece I mentioned in the book is Disordre, which is the guy, literally, you listen to it, but also it's nice because it's in the title, where he's trying to make ugliness with piano keys. There's a great scene, if you've ever read That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, where it talks about basically the Satanists try to dehumanize a guy by putting him in a room with no symmetry. Right, that attacks the mind's desire for order. All those would be good examples, and there's a lot of that in high level art. What's called high level art. There's a lot of deliberate attempts not to create a new form, not to give us a new order, but just to attack existing traditional orders. That's bad. I would say that's immoral.
What happens when somebody focuses too much on beauty, John Mark? Like, you're just overly consumed with beauty. What does that do to us?
So there's a real sense in which you can't become too focused on beauty as such if we say that beauty is ultimately God.
Okay.
The real danger, right, is that, as we said, we focus too much on narrow and ultimately superficial forms of created beauty. So, for instance, if I just become obsessed with music, there are going to be other broader beauties that I'm not. The example I give in the book, and this is one that affects a lot of dads. I have a hard time with, I have 7 kids. I have a hard time with the house not being neat, and it's just not neat, and it's not neat a lot. And
welcome to my world.
Yeah, I get really. I heard one priest who said, until you can sit at peace in the mess, God will not really be able to use you. And that's really been convicting for myself, because I struggle with that. But one of the images I've tried to use is try to say, well, look, the real beauty, the masterpieces we're working on right now are the kids, and our house is the palette. And I can't be obsessed with how the palette looks. The palette gets messy when you paint a painting. So that's our house. Our house is our brushes and our palette. It's going to be messy for another 20 years or so. And then we can wash it. Fine. Then we can clean up the palette. But for now, the beauty. So again, you can get too focused on the wrong kinds of relatively superficial beauty. You don't want to become someone who loves fine art, but can't handle the difficult, brutal beauty of life. That you don't want.
I suppose this appreciation or lack of appreciation affects us when it comes to how it is we approach the liturgy as well. Right? Because we have tendencies on both sides, right?
Yeah, no, I think very much so. On the one hand, and let's just talk about sensible beauty that is accessible through the architecture, through the artwork, through the music. So on the one hand, you can be stingy with that. You can not care about that. You can ignore that. And then you're going to make it that much harder for people to pray. And basically the reason you ignore it is because you don't care about spiritual things. So it's really, there's this quote that's quoted ad nauseum from von Balthasar that basically beauty, goodness, and truth, they're three sisters, and you kick one out, you'll lose the others. And I say in the book, I think you can actually verify that. If you go to a church that's ugly, that has no attempt for beautiful music, no attempt for beautiful art, you're probably not going to have a lot of sound doctrine, and you're probably not going to have a lot of charitable work in that parish, because these are three ultimate realities that go together. On the other hand, my temptation, and the temptation of a lot of people in my world, is that if the church isn't beautiful, if there's not luxuriant art and traditional lovely music, I get so distracted that I can't pray and I just sit there angry. And my example of that, I actually call that lusting after the church. Because imagine, when you first meet your wife, her physical beauty is playing a big role in your relationship and in your pursuit of her. But I've been married almost 20 years. If my wife wakes up with a bad hair day, or she has some rash or something, and I say, whoa, you know what? Can't even relate to you. I can't even see you through those unappealing physical trappings. Something's really wrong with me. What kind of immature? So if you're a Catholic and you've been a Catholic for a long time, and if the physical manifestation of the church is repulsive to you and that makes you unable to pray, man, you got to pray that your relationship with the Lord grows and gets a little more mature.
Yeah, and I would say get on parish council and try to help help the beauty of your parish.
Yeah, that's heroic, but yeah.
I did that. It was it's time off of purgatory
for
sure.
Good for you.
Given the fact, I kind of want to go back to this whole thing about art and such, but given the fact that there's an objectivity in beauty, does that mean that there is an obligation for an artist to only work within a given set of parameters when they are creating art?
It seems to me that the way I would respond, it's a good question, but I would say within certain parameters in principle, but maybe not in practice. So in principle, I do think order and surprise, that's what an artist is supposed to be doing. That's your job. That's how you serve the common good. That's how you reflect the creativity of God. God only works within those parameters. He only does what is orderly and surprising. So that should be good enough for you too. On the other hand, practically, because there are ever new forms of order to discover and express oneself through, that means practically there's always going to be new genres that can develop, new ways of doing traditional things. So it's not a real restriction to say, yeah, always do something that's conducive to intelligence and freedom. Always make sure your art is beautiful. Make sure that you can identify how it's orderly and surprising. But within that, you can create forever in radically new ways.
See, and that's a beautiful thing, because I think, and maybe even more so as Catholics, we have a kind of a knee jerk against the new. right? We only want what's old because the old is beautiful. It's tried and true. And certainly, I mean, we all know tradition is beautiful. There's beautiful art. That's where most of it came from. But we don't want to close ourselves out to the creativity of the human person and our ability, since we're created in the image of God, to create new forms of beauty.
Yeah, no, newness. Again, novelty, it gets a bad reputation, and certainly it becomes bad whenever it's separated from order. But remember, Augustine has that great line, late have I loved you, beauty ever ancient, ever new. Newness is a sign of life. If you can't make something new, you are dead. You are no longer Christ's living church.
Mic drop from Augustine. So my oldest daughter is going off to her doctoral program, as I told you before we started recording. And I said, hey, I'm getting ready to record a podcast on beauty. What do you want me to ask? And she thought about it for a second and she said, well, ask him if a poem, and I think I kind of already know what your answer is going to be. You've touched on this, but I thought it was a good question. Like, if a poem is full of bad words and images and such, can it still be beautiful if it's exquisitely written?
Yeah. So you can have, as always, right? You can have a mixture. You can have an ugly story well told. You can have an ugly painting with a beautiful frame. And you can have a poem that is beautiful in some ways and ugly in others. Now, here's the trick. And this is really connected to what we celebrate tomorrow. What the Lord was able to do was incorporate all the ugliness in the world and make it all contribute to the beauty. So if ugliness is going to be present in art, it better not be for the sake of the ugliness. It better serve the beauty. There's this wonderful, I think it's so inspiring. Down in, I don't know if they still have them, but in the DC Zoo, they took a bunch of trash that they found in the oceans, and they made animal sculptures out of it. It's like, oh, that's the Lord. That's what the Lord does. That's God's genius, to make beauty out of brutality, to take disorder and make it work towards order. That's why you're allowed to have villains in your stories. That's why you're allowed to describe, sometimes in pretty brutal detail, the evils of life. But you and the reader both better be brought to a greater sense of order through that. And that's a very delicate question. Many people, you better make sure, in other words, you better make sure that you're not incorporating the ugly pieces just for the shock value, just for the disorder payoff. All that stuff has to be incorporated so that you can see how much stronger order is than disorder. That's really delicate. That's really hard. But that's what the Lord does tomorrow.
And the kinds of people that are just seeking shock value never last anyway. There's no longevity to that kind of art, so to speak.
No, as we said, it's always subject to the law of diminishing returns. Robert Bolt was responding, the great playwright was responding to Brecht's concept of alienation. He said, this will destroy theater. It will lead to the actors just screaming obscenities at the audience, which is exactly what it's done. So it does cut its own throat if you make shock value the goal.
What you're just talking about with regard to what we're doing tomorrow. We're recording this on a Holy Thursday, so we're moving into Good Friday, and that's what you're referencing.
Oh, yeah.
Just talking about asceticism again, and we see how Christ took the trash of this world, so to speak, and made it beautiful. The asceticism that we practice in Lent and other times of the year, this is what prepares us again to see the tragic beauty of what's taking place, because all of the garbage of the world is being made new again, so to speak, as the Lord is using basically the contents of how we've marred the artistic masterpiece he's given us in our humanity and our world in general. We've disfigured it, and he's taking it and turning it and making it something new again. And if you don't practice this life of self-denial and holding yourself back, not just during Lent, but at all times of the year as well, you're never going to recognize the beautiful nature of the cross. You're never going to understand that this bloody sacrifice is the most beautiful event that has ever occurred in human history.
No, absolutely. It's again, doesn't what's the origin of ascesis? What is that?
Exercise.
Exercise. Yeah. If you don't exercise, if you don't discipline, you don't get the delight of beauty. If you do not, the path to beauty, I mean, it really tracks with again, obviously with the Lord's example and his directives. Unless you pick up the cross, unless you die, you don't rise. All these things. Unless you master yourself so that you don't give in to indulgence, either the safe indulgence of banality or the sort of dizzying, perverse indulgence of disorder. You'll never get that peaceful enthusiasm, which you're supposed to get on Easter, right? Easter is where you say, wow, it's all good. And it's so good. That's what you want to say. It's all good and it's so good. That's beauty, and that's Easter. You don't get that without penance. You don't get it without asceticism.
Not at all. I want to turn to page 112 of your book. And by the way, again, the book Beauty, What It Is and Why It Matters. Guys, grab this book. There's so much in this. It's so good. And we're just skimming the surface. There's so many chapters in here I want to get into, but I want people to purchase the book as always. Let's see if I can find this line. I think I wrote it down as well. Maybe I wrote it down. Let me see here. Yeah, here it is. If beauty essentially involves order, then the revealed doctrine of the Trinity alone shows how the ultimate principle of all things is beautiful. So how does the order of the three persons of the Trinity speak to beauty? Is it just by virtue of the order? Unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, there's a couple ways. And Aquinas, everything Aquinas does is super influential because he's Aquinas. But he actually didn't write. He didn't write hardly anything about beauty. And the main thing he wrote when discussing the Trinity, and specifically the Son. So you do have some kind of wild, mysterious order in the Trinity, right? Because you have first Father, then Son, then Holy Spirit. And anytime you have this enumeration, this sequence, you have order. But you also have order in the sense that the Son is perfectly proportional to the Father. Aquinas has this very interesting line. He says, even an ugly thing well represented is beautiful. Because if you take something ugly, but then you make something that matches it, you've actually created an order between them. So you've created beauty. What if you have supreme goodness, not supreme ugliness, but supreme goodness, and then you create a perfect proportion between those two things? Well, that's the order that exists, for instance, between the Father and the Son. That's why Aquinas likes to associate beauty with the Son, because there is this infinite, perfect proportion. So that's the order. And then, I explore some possible ways where you can even say that there's surprise that you have in God, in the Trinity, because surprise is when something is unexpected. And technically, because God sees everything all at once, it's amazing to think, but God is literally seen everything. His Son, His Spirit. The Father and Son are seeing their Father. They're seeing the whole story of creation. They're seeing it for the first time. God has never seen any of this before because He sees everything in one perfect, all-encompassing moment. So literally, I think this is so cool. Literally everything is unexpected to God. All the goodness of Himself and all the goodness of all He has done and all He has made is unexpected. So the Lord is seeing infinite order with pure surprise. Not in the sense that He was expecting one thing and got something else, but in the sense that He wasn't expecting anything, and here it all is in all its magnificence. So God's experience is one of all-encompassing beauty.
Sheesh. You're going to have to make me go back and rethink some more things about grace and free will. And I mean, that just adds a whole nother level of the discussion to me. Oh, that in itself is beautiful. All right. So let me ask you one last thing and kind of get a little practical here with people, because you mentioned that not only do we need to appreciate beauty, and we touched on this a little bit, but we have there's an onus on us to create beauty. So what if somebody listening to this is like, look, man, I don't have an aesthetic bone in my body. Like, it's hard enough to get my socks to match my shoes and my pants and whatever. How is it that I'm supposed to create beauty? I'm just not that artist type.
Oh, yeah. Great. So lots of ways. One way I talk about a lot in the book, but basically all of them domestic. All the things I'm going to say are domestic ways of creating beauty. So make an altar for your family, make a prayer corner, make an icon corner. If you're the chef for the family, renew your commitment to making different kinds of homemade food for your family. That's serving your family with beauty 3 times a day. Order and surprise. There's a whole section in the book on culinary art. People who think they don't have anything to do with beauty and are serving up new good meals for their family every day. They're super artists in a super studio. Making your bed, cleaning up your room. This is all ways where you create order in ways that are distinctively your own. Mowing the lawn, planting flowers in front of the picture of Our Lady. All this stuff is making us more fit for heaven. Little acts of service where you decorate, where you serve, where you clean up. Be aware of it. And know that it's not just developing your humanity, but it is serving others.
Yeah, I'd also add to this, and you touch on this in the book, by focusing on virtue, right? I mean, let's make ourselves more beautiful by becoming more like Jesus Christ. And you do that by practicing the spiritual life.
Yeah, I know you got to end, but I just love that Chesterton comment that the secret to living beautifully is to break the conventions and keep the commandments.
I love that line too. Draw that out a little bit for us. I mean, talk about that. I mean, what exactly is he getting at?
Well, my take is that if beauty is order and surprise, order means things being the way they're supposed to be, corresponding to their nature, not like the Madagascar penguin, but corresponding to their nature. Well, keeping the commandments is how we make sure we correspond to our nature. So keep the commandments, be orderly, live in an orderly way, and break the conventions. Do things that are unexpected, do things that are atypical, and that will give you surprise. That's what every saint did, from St. Francis to Joan of Arc to St. Benedict to Mother Teresa, Padre, all of them, John Paul II. They're all surprising because they broke conventions. That's got to be that's how you become a saint. That's how you live a beautiful life.
Yeah, I love that. There's all kinds of that kind of stuff in this book, guys. Beauty, what it is, why it matters. I mean, there's so many other chapters in here. John Mark, this is a real service to the church, because really helping people understand beauty is helping people understand God. And it's so paramount that we reclaim this in culture in general, particularly in our church, but in our own lives, in our families. And I mean, I'm assuming people, obviously you get this at Sophia Institute Press. Assuming it's available on Amazon and all the normal places. Do you have a website, or is there any place that you like to send people to learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
No, but thank you very much for asking. I appreciate the opportunity to be on platforms like yours.
This is great. I love this discussion, and I'm gonna have to take a look at some of your other books as well. I was not aware that you had written 5, so go take a look at all the rest of them as well, and maybe we'll have you back on the podcast to talk about another one.
That'd be great. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's lovely talking to you.
You too. Thank you so much, John Mark. I really loved having John Mark on the show, and I thought he did a tremendous job taking us into the heart of beauty. Before we wrap up, don't forget to check out the pilgrimage to Fatima, Spain, and Lourdes. There's a link down below that will take you to the video and more details. Or again, you can call 206 Tours at 800-206-TOUR. But with that, let's close with the words of St. Paul as we enter into a new phase in church history with the election of a new Holy Father. These are the words of Romans 12:12 and are something that we can all live by at all times. Rejoice in hope. Endure in affliction, persevere in prayer.